Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Musical Innertube. I'm Don Rooney.
And I'm John Timpain, and our guest today is Inga Saffron, who was my esteemed colleague at the Inquirer for more than 20 years. She writes on architecture and often is in the news pages, too, because architecture is so central to Philadelphia. And the main difference here is that I'm no longer at the paper, but she certainly is, and it's a good thing. And she has a new book out called Becoming Philadelphia, which chronicles many of the, you could say, the regrowth pains of Philadelphia in the last 20 years. So welcome, Inga Saffron. It's great to have you on the Musical Innertube.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
I would be remiss if I didn't start our discussion today by throwing you the softest of softballs and ask you to talk about what the architectural scene is in Philadelphia right now, what is or is not happening during this era of COVID.
Well, so right before COVID, Philadelphia was really, I guess you could say, enjoying or undergoing the longest sustained building boom since maybe the early 20th century. The past 10 years has just been nonstop. And then when COVID happened, first, building sites, construction sites had to shut down. But once they were allowed to reopen, much to my surprise, the developers just kept right on going. And, there've been openings and they seem completely undaunted. And the number of applications for new projects hasn't stopped, and that includes a few office buildings as well as residential. Now, whether they all get built is another story, but developers have just been filing new applications like crazy because they seem to believe that when this is all over, people will still need places to live. And cities will still be attractive. I mean, they remain undaunted.
In your book, you do this, and I'd love you to do it on our show too. And what are the things over the past 20 years that Philadelphia as a whole, its leaders and its builders and its people, what has Philadelphia done right to foment this growth that is so much remarked?
Yeah. So I think it's more, what hasn't it done? And, we know the whole sort of history of cities over the last half century, this terrible period of urban renewal when so many cities, tore down their downtowns and destroyed fabulous buildings and created all these surface lots. And, Philadelphia did a lot of that bad stuff too. And I would say, Philadelphia did less damage than some other cities, and it never completely destroyed its downtown. And it had, a lot of fine buildings, and it had, unlike many cities, especially like newer Western cities, people always lived downtown here, and because Philadelphia never destroyed its whole downtown, you had this core residential population in the center and beyond the center. And so when, cities became cool again in the late 90s, this was a living place. It didn't have to be reconstructed from scratch the way we've seen like certain cities, particularly in the West, like Denver or Salt Lake City or Seattle even, which had, really, had these, sort of Potemkin downtowns. We had this living city with neighborhoods and, where, real businesses and real social connections. And I think that was a great starting point. And, then if you want to talk about some policies, I even though our 10-year property tax abatement is quite controversial because it really rewards the most affluent people, it was a big incentive that helped jumpstart a lot of new construction. And, even though I'm kind of critical in the book of some of these mega projects that were pushed by the Rendell administration, projects like the Kimmel Center, some museum projects, they created a sense that, things were happening here.
Right.
So I would praise that. The other thing I would also say, that has been to Philadelphia's advantage is transit. That's another thing we didn't destroy. LA and Detroit famously ripped up their trolley lines, and we did not. And while we don't have a system, that can compare to New York or Boston, we have a pretty good transit network, and you can follow the growth along the Market Frankfurt L. You can see just how powerful that has been in contributing to new development, because it connects the northern river wards to Center City and to the university districts and all these job centers.
Right. I think that's something that people probably don't appreciate about Philadelphia who don't live there, is that it's a much used transit system.
Mm-hmm.
And for our listeners who may not be from town, the Market Frankfurt L is one of two major elevated routes that connect not far distant suburbs, but fairly distant suburbs with Center City. So there's been a lot of growth all around that. By the way, I want to make sure people realize one of the many great things about Inga is that she is a true Center City pioneer. She and I used to see each other when I was crossing the street on my way to work, and she was on her bike. You're a great bike pioneer, and it is a town where a lot of people walk to work. It's part of being in Philadelphia is watching folks walking down the sidewalk in the thousands to their jobs.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
One of the things that has always struck me, and you were talking about some of the cities out west, and I know that this is a big failing of those cities, or in a lot of people's eyes, is the fact that when we're talking about transportation, we're talking about roadways, major thoroughfares cutting right through the city. And Philly has the Vine Street Expressway and I-95 that take out huge chunks of the city and devote it to car traffic. Is, in your estimation, is that good or bad? Does that bring people to the city, but does that also then cut up neighborhoods and make things a little awkward?
The justification for those kinds of highways was that, cities needed to be connected to other cities, that they needed these freight, they needed to have, goods and services delivered on the highways. I guess we could look back and say, could it have been more sensitively done? I do think 676 is a big gulf. And there, a few years ago, there was actually a really interesting conversation about whether it could be, right now it's a submerged, highway. And there was a conversation about whether it could be elevated to grade level and turned into, what do they call it? Like a boulevard.
Mm-hmm.
Would that be better? Would that be less of a gulf between, it basically cuts off the center city from the neighborhoods to the north. And so that conversation was taking place. It was toward the end of the Obama administration. And then, of course, nobody was interested in it after that. But I thought that was quite interesting. And, I've written quite a bit about I-95, which cuts off the city, Center City, and some of the River Ward neighborhoods from the Delaware River. And I've written that part of 95 could be turned also into a boulevard. Because it's a little bit redundant. There is a boulevard called Columbus Boulevard, or it used to be called Delaware Avenue, that runs alongside it. So part of it is a little redundant. And, maybe it's still early to talk about these ideas, but, our world is going to be changing very fast. And, the way we get around is going to change a lot. So maybe not in my time, but maybe, a couple decades from now, we'll be able to do those things.
Inga, one of the great set pieces in your book is you talking about the new construction of the Comcast building. And one of the things that you like about it, and this is a philosophical strain in almost all of your writing about architecture, is that it communicates well with the street, where there's a sense that people can walk beside it, walk through it. There is that intercourse with what's going on. I'd love you to talk more about, first of all, that building in particular, and why you value that in new buildings.
Yeah. Well, a lot of my ideas were formed by a writer named Jane Jacobs, who wrote this book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. And there's, long passages there about, the life of cities taking place at street level. She calls it the ballet of the sidewalk. And she talks about eyes on the street. These are phrases that are so deeply embedded in our language, we don't even think about them anymore. But when she wrote them in the early 60s, it was a really radical idea that we needed to be able to see activity as we walk down the street, to feel safe and comfortable in cities. We needed people to watch out for us. We needed this interplay of, between people just going about their daily lives and the buildings. And that's one reason I don't like parking garages, because you don't have any of that interplay. So with the new Comcast Tower, technically called the Comcast Technology Center, which was designed by Norman Foster's firm, a lot of people have mixed feelings about it. Some awkwardness in the execution of the mast. It's the tallest building in Philadelphia. It's one of the 10 tallest buildings in the United States. And it's a very thin tower that sits on this big podium. It actually looks as if the podium looks as if it was a kind of a train shooting through the legs of this tower. And I think Foster did that on purpose because he wanted to reference Philadelphia's industrial past and its great railroading past. But we have a long history of judging skyscrapers by how they look on the skyline. Everybody wants the tallest building. They want the spire to be really spectacular. And what they overlook is that, your experience for the most part is at the ground level. And I give Comcast some credit for making an incredibly public ground floor realm in that building. And just a little bit of background, because so Comcast is a big technology company like Apple or Google or Facebook. All those places, they put their headquarters deep in the suburbs, and they're like fortresses. No one has ever reviewed the new Apple headquarters, which is also designed by Norman Foster, because Apple won't let any journalists in. It is a top secret encampment with 12,000. We used to have 12,000 people working there before COVID. It's totally disconnected from where people live. People have to take these incredibly long bus rides to get to work. So Comcast is one of the first big tech giants to locate its headquarters embedded in the city, and it's totally connected to the city. You can go straight from that podium down an escalator into Suburban Station, the train station. You can connect to the Market Frankfurt L or the Broad Street line, which we just talked about, to trolleys. It's totally networked into the life of the city, and the whole space, which is enormous, is public. You can just walk in that door, and it's a beautifully designed room, if I can call it that. It's quite big. That it has kind of like this bird cage of wooden slats enveloping it, and you walk in, and there are trees and seats, and then and artwork, and you can take an escalator to the mezzanine, and there's a fancy restaurant and a coffee bar, and you could and there's free wireless, and you can hang out. And Comcast also has this little attraction, which I think has not been a success, but it's this giant globe that you can walk into, and there's some kind of very souped up 3D video imagery inside. So there's this whole public aspect to the building, and in addition to all the public stuff on the ground floor, which was meant to have like a market. I don't know if that ever took off, but in addition to all that, I mean, one of the most wonderful things about the building, and I'm sorry this is closed because of COVID, is so there's a hotel, the Four Seasons, at the top of the building, which is a super fancy hotel. And there's a glass elevator that goes to the top, and there's a restaurant and a bar. And you can just take that elevator to the top, which is over 1,000 feet. And the views are spectacular. And it's another public thing, this amazing viewing platform. And I have to say, the elevator is very high speed. And when you're in that glass elevator going up to the top, you feel like you're in a movie and the whole city is unfurling like in front of your eyes. It's a very fun, remarkable experience. Before COVID, people actually lined up just to take the elevator to the top. And then, you can sit at the bar, you can have a martini. It's all very sparkly and fun. So I give Comcast a lot of credit for not being afraid to let the public into its inner sanctum and to interact with the city. I think it makes them a better company.
I almost hate to admit how much I enjoyed walking through that ground floor because I really did love it. I really, it had a real pop to it. There's a lot of vitality and human energy in that place. What is an example of a building that does the opposite, that's really bad at all these things, that is very sort of antisocial in town? What's an example?
I mean, let me just the computer brain works very slowly these days. But let me see what's a little. I mean, there have been plenty of buildings that have and office buildings that have followed this approach. I mean, it used to be very, very common for every single office building and public building in Center City to have a direct connection to the subways. You see that in the old Wanamaker's building. You see that in what used to be the Girard Trust headquarters tower. The SEPTA building on Market Street has a lot of connections. But trying to think. I mean, the old Aramark building on Market Street, which was built in the 80s, I would say is has a kind of a small footprint and a small lobby, so it's not that welcoming. What happened after 9/11, as we all know, is that there was a total freak out over security in public buildings, and so now you got to sign in, and people are very suspicious. The city, there's a city office building called the Municipal Services Building,
right?
Which puts you through a lot of rigmarole when you go in. I mean, as a young reporter, I used to love like sneaking into government office buildings and like finding my way to my subject's office and, making it impossible for them to avoid me. But you can't do that anymore.
When I was regularly visiting Philadelphia in the early part of this 21st century, I was working at KYW. And that was an interesting drive because you could go down the Schuylkill Expressway and see the skyline of the city, as you mentioned earlier. And then as you made your way into the city, KYW at the time was off of Independence Mall. So you would go in, you would see historical buildings, you would see a few office buildings, including the one where I had to go to work. And then just a few feet away, you would start to see residential areas.
Mm-hmm.
And it occurred to me that it was a very, very nice mix of everything a city is about. Is that sort of the ideal situation for a city where John had mentioned earlier, a lot of people walk to work in Philadelphia? Is that sort of a good mix for a city to have the residential areas sort of built in rather than kept away from the office buildings and the center part of the city?
It's the ideal situation for a city to have residential larded in with offices, and that's because and this is another idea that comes from Jane Jacobs. We talk about the 24/7 city. Typically, and this is all pre-COVID, people worked 9 to 5 or 10 to 6 or whatever. They left, and in cities that had no residential downtown, they'd roll up the sidewalks, and it would be dark and quiet and boring and maybe unsafe. And so what we've seen happen beyond Philadelphia in the last 20 years is that cities that had segregated the office part of their cities from the residential part have really gone to great lengths to build housing downtown. We see that in places like Columbus, Ohio. They had a business group that got together and organized development of residential downtown. I mean, I've traveled. One of my hobbies is to travel to other cities. I mean, I've seen it in Birmingham. I've seen it in Atlanta, in Denver, in all kinds of cities where you wouldn't expect to see residential downtown, but cities are falling over themselves to have that. And I think it's everyone's spending a lot of time talking about what cities are going to be like after COVID. And, when working from home is really institutionalized, and I think we're going to have the bedroom city. We used to talk about the bedroom suburb. That's where people went at night. And, the thing that will save cities is, well, one of the things, I hope, my fingers are crossed, is you already have a lot of people living downtown. Maybe some office buildings will be converted to apartments. There'll be a lot of density of population. You'll see a response in terms of restaurants and activities and parks. And, because people are a bit closer together in cities, you'll have the population to support that stuff. And ideally, those cities, even if they have fewer office workers, will remain alive. That's my hope. And I live quite close to downtown Philadelphia, to Center City, and it's been incredibly lively here. There might actually be more people on the street during the day because they're not in their offices. So that's been kind of pleasant.
I thought I'd ask a question, which I'm just curious to hear you talk about, actually. There's been an effort, as you probably know better than we do, on the federal level to try to limit the kinds of architecture you see in Washington, D.C. to classical, only classical.
Not just Washington, D.C.
Yes, I'm sure there's several other places who would like this. And I'm wondering what your feelings are about that. I mean, I kind of like the growing diversity of what you see in Washington myself. Not all the buildings are successful, but I kind of like the idea that you can see an older building like the Smithsonian with those crazy towers, right? And but also see your Doric and Ionic columns, right? And all the things that we think of as great public buildings, right? But also see some modern things like the Art Museum, and I kind of like that. A lot of people don't, and I'm wondering what your feelings are about this effort to just name one kind of architecture, declare it the winner, and say this is the way we should always build in our leadership centers.
Yeah. Well, there's certain parallels with our attempts by our current president to declare himself a winner unilaterally.
You don't say.
And, yeah. So this has been a hot topic the last couple of days because some advocates of classical architecture, drafted this executive order mandating that all federal buildings, not just in DC, but any buildings built by the federal government should be built in the classical style. I thought it was like just clickbait for Twitter when it was first written, but it turns out that President Trump has signed this. And, I don't think it's going to stand. I don't think the Biden administration is going to enforce it, or I don't know how these executive orders get overturned exactly, but so let me just start with saying, from a practical point of view, building in a classical style, if you're really serious about it, is very, very expensive. We don't have stone carvers. Like, they're not a dime a dozen anymore, and we can't exploit them and pay them very low salaries. So we don't have the craftspeople to build these. And so I would say that's one thing. So good luck with that. The second thing I would say, there have been a number of classical revivals over time. And, classical architecture began in, ancient Rome and Greece, and it's made a number of comebacks in the Renaissance, in the early 20th century. Initially in America, we, I guess in the first, in the, early part of American history, America had no past, basically, and we were looking for a style to express our very revolutionary ideas about democracy. And so we looked back to ancient Greece and Rome, where you saw the first beginnings of democracy, and we said, there's some representative democracy, and that's the kind of buildings that they did it in. So we tried to emulate that, but then we got bored. Then we had
right.
We had all these other styles, we cycled through the Neo-Gothic and Neo-Byzantine and Neo this and Neo that in the late 19th century. And then we had another classical revival because people got fed up with all this craziness, like the Smithsonian. And then in the early 20th century, we had a big fad for classical architecture because it was seen as orderly and beautiful and clean. But, the thing is, not only is it expensive to build and to build well, but, technology, the needs of technology changes. The needs of people change. It's one thing to build a classical temple when you're building a courthouse or an art museum. It's quite another thing when you're building 1,000-foot high building for Comcast, to make that classical, because the needs of that building are very, very different. The elevators, the fire exits, the circulation, the ventilation, all the ideas that inform classical architecture don't really work so well. And then on top of that, you have needs of sustainability and environmental concerns. And so just like everything else, architecture is a response to changing, changes in the way we live, changing technology, so the idea that you can just mandate this style is kind of crazy. So then now I'll just talk about sort of the philosophical problems with it. And the idea of imposing one uniform style on the whole country is crazy, and it's fascist, frankly, because architecture at its best responds to the site, to local conditions, to the context, to the civilization, to the culture. Who imposed classical architecture on their country? The Nazis, the Soviets. Do we want to be like that? And I hear advocates of this, people who support this executive order say, well, the public hates modern architecture. Well, that's a very broad statement. Some people don't like some modern buildings. It's true.
Sure.
But look at all these fancy high-rise condos going up in cities across the country and the world. They're all modern because people love big windows, right. And they love big views. And the most expensive buildings are modern. Every time there's some new modern museum, the Guggenheim Bilbao, people love it. They're fascinated by it. I mean, sure, there are bad modern buildings. There are bad buildings in every style. But, and again, that's the problem with mandating a single style. Because you can have bad classical buildings too. There are plenty of them. We just don't know how to read them anymore. So we like them all. But, so that whole order is very confused. And I would like to remind people that Trump, as the developer, built plenty of tasteless modern buildings. And he tore down plenty of beautiful classical buildings, like I believe it was the famous Bonwit Teller building in yes. New York.
And he ripped down all the beautiful ornamentation from the face of one of the buildings that he bought.
Mm-hmm.
First thing that he did, and I think it was against city ordinance, but it didn't matter. He still ripped it down and said, "Go ahead. What are you going to do?"
Yeah. Nice. So, I just see it as Twitter clickbait, because it's another way of dividing the so-called elites from the people. I just, I don't want to bite.
Excellent.
Let me ask you a question about gentrification as a way to get a city going. Here in Harrisburg, for a while there in the 80s and 90s, the mayor took some dilapidated buildings, and there are quite a few in Harrisburg, and they're mostly row homes. You could buy it for $1, but when you signed the contract, you had to promise to renovate it to code and then stay in it, live in it yourself for 2 to 3 years or whatever the contract said. Is that a good idea? And is that something that can help cities with a lot of dilapidated buildings and a lot of sketchy areas come back to life?
So, Philadelphia did the same thing in Society Hill in the 60s. And I'm sure cities across the country did that because we what happened is, after World War II and after deindustrialization, we saw a lot of people leave cities. We saw their populations decline. They had more buildings than they knew what to do with. And then there was a big, starting around the 60s, there were efforts to repopulate cities or repopulate their depopulated places. And even when I first started as architecture critic in 1999, Philadelphia was still losing population from different neighborhoods, and there was an argument that we should give people incentives to renovate and fix up houses, and it was very, very effective. What we didn't anticipate at that time, and what you have to sort of now, looking back, examine some of our assumptions. What we call what's a failed depopulated neighborhood to one person is somebody's home to another, and we didn't anticipate the gold rush that would result, and we didn't anticipate how it would affect housing prices and property taxes. And we didn't anticipate what it would do to less affluent people who had stuck it out through very difficult times. We didn't understand the racial component. And I think, there's been a greater realization over the last few years. This is all very complex.
Yeah.
And yes, we want cities to thrive, and we want people to want to live in cities. And we want them to pay taxes because we have a lot of, one of the great things about cities is, this is a place where people without much money can find housing and work and transit and make a life for themselves. And we need other people who are better off to pay the taxes to, kind of even things out. So, we have to kind of manage this growth and gentrification and make sure that vulnerable people are protected. So, it's taken us a while to really understand all those forces. They're incredibly complex, and it's really hard to game the system and make sure everything comes out fair and square for everyone. But I think it's a big struggle right now.
One of the things that has always been challenging about trying to quote unquote renovate Philadelphia is, you've got this amazing center city, which is still expanding, and the advent of 20 and 30 somethings over the last 20 years has really enlivened the city. But then you have, some of the worst stretches of blighted housing north of Sao Paulo. I mean, you have this Swiss cheesy aspect where you might have a block that's okay and then another block that's vacant, and it's really hard to know what to do. You point out the complexities of it. I think this is the poster child for complex difficulties.
I am continually amazed as I bike around, how development pokes its finger into what you think are completely forgotten and abandoned corners. Every time I bike, into some little corner of the city I hadn't been before, I just cannot believe my eyes, just how far this boom has stretched. And one reason actually that there are some areas that are not affected so much by the boom, I would say, has to do with politicians making it more difficult to develop there because they're afraid of the displacement that will occur if there were no restrictions.
I was very entertained by your attitude toward the famous parking lot on Independence Mall, and which is an example of something that doesn't work very well. And I'm wondering, is the cars days numbered, or what's going to happen with cars? I mean, you need them now. It's. I mean, the city of the future is probably going to have cars for generations to come.
Yeah, no, I think a couple more decades at least. So the first thing that's likely to happen is we're gonna have good electric vehicles, both cars and buses. And then after that, they will evolve into driverless cars. And we might not see the end of cars, but we might see the end of the personal car. Like maybe when there are, autonomous vehicles, as they're called, you won't need to actually own your own autonomous vehicle. You'll just tap your phone or maybe your forehead, I don't know, and summon this autonomous vehicle and go wherever you're going. I mean, I think there's going to be hybrids of transportation. Maybe this is like perhaps wishful thinking. We'll have way better mass transit, but it's not economically viable to, let's say, go to some suburb 30 miles out of the city by mass transit. So maybe you would take transit 15 miles and then summon an autonomous vehicle and go the last 15 miles on your own. That's one thing that could happen, and you can see mass transit companies partnering with autonomous vehicle companies, where, transit serves the densest, most efficient part of the network, and the less efficient part of the network is served by autonomous vehicles. That's one very likely scenario. But I don't think cars will go away, but I do think the personal car, because who wants to own a car? You gotta pay for it. You gotta fix it. You gotta house it. It's so much work.
Yes.
At least that's how I feel. I know a
No,
lot
I
of
mean,
people
there's
disagree.
a lot of ways. There's a lot of ways in which car culture doesn't work, but we all uphold it because it gives us something that we all want, which is freedom of movement, right? I mean, and so we're willing to sacrifice, the climate itself.
Oh yeah, I didn't mention that. Yeah. So there's that. How serious are we about climate change?
Yeah.
But I do think this hybrid model where, better, tighter transit networks in the most dense places, with autonomous vehicles or electric cars in the less dense places. That, because America is not Europe. Europe is older, more densely settled. We have a really big landmass with a lot of space between places, and it would be pretty hard to get the quality of transit for all those places that we we want.
And personally, I don't think we're officially in the future until we have Jetsons flying cars.
Yeah.
That'll tell me that we've arrived.
Yeah.
Hey,
leave it to Elon Musk.
Yeah.
Right.
Inga, thanks very much for being with us today.
My pleasure. It was fun talking to you guys.
Taking us through the city and beyond, I guess.
Lovely to have
All right.
you.
Yeah. Nice to see you, John. Thanks, Don. Nice to meet you.
And as always, thanks to you for listening to the Musical Innertube. If you'd like to get in touch with us, the email address is musicalinnertube, all one word, @gmail.com. On Twitter, John is @JTimPayne, Don is @DonRooney9, and our webpage is Musical Innertube. That's musical spelled with 2 A's, .libsyn, spelled LIBSYN.com. We're available on Amazon Music. If you're a member of Amazon Prime or are subscribed to Amazon Music, just type Musical Innertube in the search box to find us. We're also available on Facebook, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio Podcasts. Like us and give us a good review on any of those platforms. And as always, thanks to virtual band Car Radio Dog for our theme music.